bad news for the faithful attached to the Latin Mass. Closures and restrictions are multiplying, and the liveliest communities are being cornered. In Detroit and Tulsa, the situation is serious, and now the Pope can no longer remain silent. It is not a matter of choice, it is an obligation. Stay until the end to understand what is really happening. In recent months, while in some dioceses we are witnessing a prudent extension of concessions for the celebration of the traditional Mass, as recently happened in Charlotte, in other places, communities linked to the ancient liturgy are instead finding themselves having to deal with imminent deadlines and new limitations. The situation is not uniform. There are bishops who, despite 1,000 difficulties, seek temporary solutions so as not to abruptly uproot what has grown with sacrifice and fidelity. But elsewhere, the climate has changed. Letters sent to parishes speak clearly. Horizons are narrowing, and traditional celebrations are being reduced or even cancelled. These are increasingly frequent signals that indicate a worrying trend. The case of Detroit is emblematic. Here, 10 parishes where the traditional Mass, according to the 1962 Missal, was regularly celebrated, were excluded from the possibility of continuing. It's not just about numbers. Those communities were alive, fervent, often more active and participatory than many others. In some of them, the traditional Mass represented the very soul of parish life. Families found their stability, doctrinal formation, coherence in the liturgy. And now all this is interrupted with the promise of redistributing these celebrations to a few points of the diocese, often far from the territory of the original parishes. It is not just a question of logistics. One perceives a desire for reduction, as if the presence of the ancient rite were now a problem to be contained. Added to this is the crackdown on the ordinary form. The celebration ad orientem is prohibited, and the use of detached altars is imposed with a peremptory deadline to adapt the churches. A precise signal that aims to standardize everything, even at the expense of liturgical experiences that had rediscovered an often forgotten beauty. In Tulsa, too, the situation has become difficult. The traditional Mass celebrated for years at the parish of Saints Peter and Paul has been interrupted without a clear explanation being given to the community. No detailed official statement, just a generic reference to logistical difficulties and lack of priests. But the new parish priest, who also knows and loves the ancient rite and has celebrated it in the past, has clearly stated that the decision is not his. Everything suggests that it is an order from above, without the possibility of discussion. If you appreciate our service of disclosure and believe in the values of truth and transparency, buy a super thank you. Each content requires commitment, study, and dedication, and our work is entirely self-financed. Your support helps us to continue this mission. Thank you very much. And the fact that even respectful questions are removed from official community channels, as happened on a parish Facebook group, suggests that transparency is not a priority in these cases. For the faithful, this sudden cancellation is a trauma. These are people who, for years, have built a life of faith around that Mass, who traveled for hours to attend, who felt part of a living and coherent church. Now they feel sidelined, as if their attachment to tradition were a mistake to be corrected or a problem to be moved to the periphery. These measures, taken almost simultaneously in two dioceses far from each other, show a trend that can no longer be read as the result of isolated initiatives. Rather, one perceives an increasingly rigid application of the directives contained in Traditionis Custodes, with an interpretation that goes well beyond simple liturgical regulation. Not only the celebration of the traditional Mass is affected, but also all those expressions which, even in the ordinary form, seek to recover the solemnity, the centrality of the sacrifice, the orientation towards the mystery. And so, alongside the ban on the Latin Mass, there also come restrictions on the celebration ad orientem, impositions on liturgical architecture, prescriptions that slowly empty any possibility of continuity with the living tradition of the Church. But what is most striking is the absence of a voice that takes a stand with clarity and charity. This creates a void that risks fueling divisions, mistrust, and a sense of abandonment. The faithful who love tradition are not creating schisms. They are fighting to remain in the Church, despite everything. But without visible and decisive leadership, the danger of dispersion becomes more real every day. In this scenario, the figure of the Pope acquires increasing weight, not because one wants to force an immediate position, but because the situation, now so widespread and articulated, requires it. The dioceses move autonomously, but not without reference to a general climate that is perceived as authorized from above. The papal silence, until now interpreted as prudence or waiting, is starting to become the object of questions even among the most patient faithful. Pressure is growing, not so much from organized groups, but from families, priests, and entire communities who see a spiritual path often built with dedication, sacrifice, and full adherence to the Church being called into question. We are not asking for a denial of the magisterium, but for a word that gives breathing space and confirms that there is still room for those who have chosen to live their faith according to the forms that for centuries have nourished generations of saints. With each day that passes without this word, the risk increases. Not so much that of sensational rebellions, but the more subtle and insidious one of an internal fracture, of a sense of exclusion that can give rise to underground currents of mistrust, perhaps silent, but profound. And the shepherd's task has always been to prevent confusion before it becomes distance. And if on the one hand, the official silence persists, on the other, authoritative voices are beginning to be raised that cannot be ignored. Cardinals such as Sarah, Burke, Müller, and Bishop Schneider have already clearly expressed the need for a return to liturgical coherence and the safeguarding of tradition. But words, however strong, are no longer enough. We need concrete decisions. The center of the Church needs to show that it is still capable of protecting and valorizing all its members without condemning to exile those who, in good faith, live the liturgy according to what they have received and loved throughout their lives. The time of waiting is over, and now we enter the time of choices, because, in the end, what is at stake is not just a form, but the very trust of the faithful in the motherhood of the Church. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment, Amen. God bless you.